So, hello everyone. Welcome to the continuous testing meetup online. So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depends on where you are. So, we start. So, at first, I want to see my next slide, and I want to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Source Labs to Amusement and Training, for helping us to organize this meetup. So let's move forward. In case you passed our last events, our last sessions, please go to our website, continuoustestingmeetup.com. You will find there all information about the last events and also the link to the video recording if you're interested in one or other topic. So today I'm very happy to have here Pooja Jagani. She works as an open source engineer and developer advocate at Browser Stack and lives in Mumbai in India. And she has a topic, Spoonfuls of Test-Driven Development and a pinch of AI ingredients for robust automation framework. So Pooja, I'm very happy to see you here. Please feel free to share your slides, and for all participants, please stay until end of this session, end of this meetup. We have a small gift for you. I think you will really love it. So Pooja, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Aksana. Thank you so much for the continuous meetup team and organizers to host me and have me here. I'm excited to speak today. Let me share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we can get started. So thank you so much for joining everyone from whichever time zone you're joining. So appropriate greetings for that. Today we will be talking about spoonfuls of test-driven development and a pinch of AI, and the goal is to kind of show you how AI can kind of help you when you're practicing test-driven development. My name is Pooja. Like we said, I work at Stack, and I think Aksana has already given an introduction. But I've been working in Selenium like as an open source developer for around roughly 5 years. So you'll always see me hanging out in that space. So if you need to reach out to me beyond today's conversation, I have my email ID, my LinkedIn, or even you'll find me on Selenium Slack as well, or even Stack as a Discord community. So you can also find me there. So feel free to have any questions. Just a little something about me. I think I wrote my first programming long ago in a language called Logo. I don't know if you remember, to make some shapes back in sixth standard, like in sixth grade. And I found that very interesting. And I think I've been stuck to coding or wanting to code or do something technical or logical since then. Yes, that's just a little something about me. Um, I will try and cover this in roughly 45 minutes, but like let's see how it goes. First, I think we have a very power-packed agenda for today. We'll start with what is test-driven development and why it's so important. Then I will show you how we integrate in building Selenium, which is a popular automation framework. What's the process we follow? What's the thought process that we have when we're actually doing test-driven development and how that's helped us? And then we kind of enter into how to use AI. So where AI fits in terms of how it can be a helpful pair programmer if given the right context and the right prompt, and why context is so powerful. And we bring this all together in a live, like in a coding demo where I actually have I like to pre-record my demos because it's a little easier for me to talk through without getting recorded, but I will show you actual true feature that I have developed in Selenium, which is available today using AI and test-driven development and how it turned out to be. So let's kickstart by understanding what is test-driven development, right? So test-driven development is a software development approach where tests are written before the actual code. So if you see, this is actually a Wikipedia definition, right? So, but it's not just about writing the test, it's not about just writing your tests before the code. It's actually about thinking that when you're writing your tests, you're actually trying to define the behavior, um, or your design behavior, like desired behavior through tests. So when you're doing it, you're thinking through the inputs, you're thinking through the outputs, how your user will use it. So you're thinking from a very different perspective in terms of how the users are going to be using your code. So test-driven development actually helps you see it from users' lens, right? And the tests we're talking about here are nothing but small tests. So these are small focus tests called the unit tests that test individual components of your code. Now, the diagram I'm about to show you is something most people would have seen if they have followed test-driven development, where what happens is you start by writing a test. So when you write a test and you try to run your code, there is no code, right? So if you're first writing your test and then writing your code, when you write a test, obviously there is no code. You'll get a compile error, things will fail. So it's all red. Slowly, then you make sure you have just enough logic to make your test pass. So it could be very minimal logic. So you can do this in small iterative thought through steps, but just basic logic to make sure your tests pass. It asserts that your code is doing the correct behavior. And once you reach this green phase, you then start to think about refactoring it. At this point, you're then confidently able to refactor because you have your tests that pass in place. So, every time your test is passing, you can refactor with confidence. You want to refactor to add a good coding practice, to modularize your methods or anything that you'd like, you can do that with confidence. So, I think this is a very popular diagram for test driven development, but I also like to think of it as a very powerful cycle where, as or a wheel, where as the wheel moves, you're actually moving the development in very small thought through steps. And let's extend this analogy a little bit further. So the if you remember, I mentioned that you'll be using for test-driven development, you'll be using unit tests. So unit tests are nothing but small focus tests. So the way unit tests are, they follow a AAA model, which is nothing but which is nothing but arrange, act, and assert. So arrange means arrange all the inputs that are required for your tests or any preconditions. Act means execute your test or the method under test at that point of time, and assert is validate if it's behaving correctly or have that confidence that your test is doing the right thing. Now we can extend that a little bit further for test driven development in the sense if you think of arrange is the red wheel here. So arrange is when you're actually assembling the entire tests with your input, how your method should look, and how the test shapes together, really, right? And then you act. So when you act, that means you're in the green phase where you're acting as if writing code. You have the active writing code just to make sure your test passes or you have the correct logic in place. And then you can consider assert as a confidence that you can assert with confidence or you can refactor with confidence to make sure your code is in very, very good shape. So that's how I like to think of this as well. Now, why all of this makes sense in a big system? I'll show you a simple diagram. So this is a simple puzzle diagram. I think most of the software people develop is a bunch of components coming together. Some are simple, some are complex, but it's always different components. And while you develop this, if you're trying to use test-driven development, slowly, iteratively, you kind of start to see that as each component is well tested, you actually have a whole system that's coming together, or a whole software that's coming together beautifully but thoroughly tested on the very core level of unit tests, right? So you can be sure that you're laying a very strong foundation where you are actually having a well-tested system, but and that's happened by design, just because you're following something like test-driven development, because the first code you write is test for any other features. Now let's extend it a little further in terms of testing pyramid. So I think most of us here would know what a testing pyramid looks like. The foundation of the testing pyramid, where you have the most number of tests, and for a good reason, are unit tests. Again, small focused tests for your pieces of code. Test driven development also focuses on unit tests. So, what happens is it kind of helps you build a very strong foundation. So, if you have A lot of unit tests, building a solid foundation. You can be sure that at least it helps you minimize the bugs or your system. You can assert with confidence that your system is doing the right thing, because at the higher level comes the integration tests and then end-to-end tests. These are uh, slower, longer, complex tests, equally important. So I'm not diminishing the importance, but then if you have a very strong foundation, it makes it easier to then check the integration of the pieces, because you know your fundamental foundation is very, very strong. So that's how we like to think of test-driven development. Um, and again, Selenium is a big advocate of it. And let's go a little bit beyond theory and tell you why I think test-driven development is so important, or why um, a project like Selenium believes sincerely in test-driven development. So, reliable APIs. Any API that you've written, if it's been tested thoroughly, it is reliable. Basically, then you know that it will do what it's expected to do, irrespective of the version, irrespective of the underlying technology change, or irrespective of any different changes that go underneath. The user experience will be unhampered. So you can rely on the API to do the right thing. For example, in Selenium, we have this API called find element, and Selenium has been around for over 2 decades, right? So it's been 20 years, this is the 21st year. So it's been around 20 years where we have this. So if you know, there's a famous API called find element. So if you're in automation, when you're trying to find an element on the web page, you could do driver.find element. And this is something that you'll see has been consistently there through Selenium 3, entire Selenium 4, and it'll be there in Selenium 5. So it's not going anywhere. But at each iteration, you can be sure that it will do the thing that's told, that it will find an element based on the locator that is passed. And we're able to do this with confidence simply because we have followed test-driven development while developing this, and it kind of assures us that it will be always be a reliable API to do the right thing, irrespective of the browsers or anything that changes in the background. Next is ergonomic design. So when I said that test-driven development is a way of kind of expressing the behavior of your code through tests, right? So that kind of lays the foundation or the basis to make sure that you have an ergonomic design. So when you're writing the test, you're setting the preconditions, you're calling certain methods before, and when actually calling the API or the a module that you're testing, you kind of see how you're using it. You're seeing, is it very complex to use? Is it intuitive? Is my ID able to, give suggestions in a correct manner if I do it this way? Will I also, if you're passing certain parameters, say for object-oriented programming, is it very lengthy, complicated? Or for not like strictly type languages, am I understanding the parameters that are mandatory, optional? How is it handling it also? As a part of this exercise, you'll automatically understand if the design is ergonomic or no. Is it easy to use? Is it intuitive? And again, one example that I would like to give you for this is nothing but Selenium has a very popular way of chaining. So if you look at Java Selenium code, it does something called driver.manage.timeouts. So when you do driver dot something, it'll give you a bunch of options. When you do manage, it'll give you a bunch of options. But they're not overwhelming number of options, right? And this is designed thinking that when you're in your IDE, you get your auto suggestions. You don't get a big list of APIs. You get a handful of APIs, and that are intuitive enough for you to understand and what they do. So if it's driver.manage.timeout, it helps you set the various timeouts that are in relation to the automation framework. The third one is backward compatibility. I can't tell you how important this is, and Selenium is huge on backward compatibility. So when we went from Selenium 3 to 4, all we ask the users to do, and you can go and verify it again in our documentation, we just ask them to change the version. On client side, all we said, just change the version and you should be good to go. And most were. Yes, no one is perfect, so there would be some bugs, but there were no major breaking changes. And there was a huge change in protocols. We went from a JSON wire protocol to a W3C WebDriver standard protocol. So internally, everything had changed. How things are operating, the code we wrote. So it was a total flip that happened internally. But the only reason we could be backward compatible, in spite of this major change that went through, or um, the changes that happen even in general from a version to version, the reason we are able to do this confidently is simply because we are using test driven development and we make sure we have exhaustive tests for everything we do. Easy refactoring. Again, every time you want to refactor a code, see, sometimes it's open source, right? So there are different folks who are contributing. We have code that originated over 10 years ago, 15 years ago, due to XYZ reason, and it was there for a reason. But over time, if it's not needed or we need to refactor it to keep up with the modern trends, standards, language patterns, we can easily do that because there'll always be tests to make sure where it's used, how it's used. And again, thanks to TDD, we have that in place. So we went from Java 8 to Java 11. And in our core Java bindings with be it the client or the server, internally it was using an HTTP client that was a third-party library. So we were able to then replace it with a Java 11, JDK offering of the HTTP client. And again, we were able to refactor without breaking anything because TDD. And the last one is minimize bugs. Well, let's be honest, who likes bugs? No one likes bugs, right? So everyone's always wanting to make sure because they're expensive. They're expensive in terms of the amount of time it takes to solve it, expensive in terms of how it hampers the user experience. So again, the more tests you have the confidence that your system works fine and you've taken care of edge cases. So it should minimize bugs. I wouldn't say eliminate ever because um, nothing is perfect, and that's just the nature of how it is. And I'm going to show you an example where if we had followed a TDD, there would be a bug that wouldn't have existed. But because probably TDD wasn't followed, it introduced a bug. And this is a real Selenium issue. So it's not something that I'm making up. This is something I actually realized while trying to triage an issue in Selenium. And let me explain the context of what it was a little bit. So if you see the picture, this is a typical drop-down list. So I think for automation frameworks, when you're testing, one of the common things is testing a drop-down. So ideally, you should be able to select an item in a drop-down. For example, item one here. And the way you would do this in JavaScript would be something like this, where you would declare a new select class, pass in the element, basically for the drop down, and go ahead and do like select by visible text. You could call a method and pass the visible text. So if you want to select item one, you would pass it item one. And this worked perfectly for years. I don't think anyone had any problem with this. Again, thanks to the TDD and all the good practices we followed and the amazing contributors that are present from the community, this worked perfectly. There was no issue at all. Now there came a little twist. So if you see this, this is again a drop-down list, but each option has a space. So one has no spaces, two has one space, three has two spaces. So it's cascading in nature. The reason it looks like that is because this is a visible text, but now there's a visible text with some spaces. You think this would work, right? Like, what's the problem? So the way you would do it, hey, I want to select three. So you add the spaces and the visible text because that's what you actually see. That's what's visible to you. And there was an error. So this was in JavaScript binding in Selenium, and it went like no such element. I can't find this element. But hey, it pretty much exists. So it's something we're doing wrong. It's not the browser, it's not the protocol. It's something that we're not doing right at this point. So I started digging into it further, only to realize that the same code, if written in Java binding, was passing. So if I'm able to do the same thing in Java binding, I know it doesn't look very different than JavaScript. The reason is we try to keep it very similar across bindings. But if we were able to do create a select object and go like select by visible text with space in Java, it passed. So I started digging a little bit further. And as I started doing that, I realized in Java, I think whoever developed it had followed test-driven development, or even if they did it the other way around, there's a good chance they did it with TDD because they had a lot of test cases that were listed that didn't test the happy paths, but also the different variations. So there was a valid test for should be able to select by visible text, but there was also a test case that should be able to select with visible text with spaces. And this was pretty much there. And you can see the commit. I have listed the GitHub issue below because this is a real issue that happened. So because these tests were in place, this bug did not enter the Java bindings. And I also checked the other language bindings. They also had this similar concept. It was literally only JavaScript for some odd reason um, that kind of missed out on this one. And we were able to fix it because other language bindings had done the right thing. They had the right test. We were able to write a test, reproduce the error quickly, and then just make sure we have the code to make that test pass. Classic TDD. Now that I've told you that this was a bug that happened and that could have TDD could have potentially minimized, let's move on to how we typically do test-driven development in Selenium, or if you're thinking of any automation framework or any project, this is a typical process that one would follow. So you would start with user stories. Again, user stories are nothing but user requirements, kind of stating or discussing how a feature looks. For open source projects, it's writing in GitHub issue about what the feature should be, what's the motivation to have that feature, what problem will it solve for the users, project, etc. And then next you move on to the design. Often, if someone is proposing a feature or requesting a feature, they may or may not include a design, but the project co-contributors or the technical committee will then figure out a design for it. Again, this can be simple or complex, and that's okay. But most of the core committers of Selenium, if they were to pick this up, they would pretty much first thing do is start by writing tests. So they would start by writing unit test and iterate over how the functionality should look. Once that's done, they would then move on to writing the code because now they have a good blueprint in terms of what the code should do, basically which test should pass, also with error checks and everything, and then try to run the test till they pass and refactor it so it gets in a good shape. And of course, after this, it goes through a code review where we again make sure that there are tests that run clearly. And if you go see a project, every time we get a pull request, the first thing we ask is for people to make sure that they're writing their tests. So this is a classic flow that we tend to follow. Now let's move on to an example, or not an example, or let's move on to a story, which I recently developed an API for the new WebDriver BiType protocol. And I speak about it in my other talks, but and also spoke about it a little bit in the Selenium conference earlier this year. And I want to kind of show you how I try to, because it's the AI era, I want to show you how I use test-driven development because that's what's baked in Selenium and how I used AI to build this feature. But the process that we followed to get till there, so let me have a walkthrough of that. So this was the user story, not the exact words. I've kind of made it a little bit more formal. It was a GitHub issue, honestly. And it was also discussed in person at the Selenium Dev Summit. So what I would want as a user to do is, as a user of test automation framework, I want to automate authentication for websites. Okay, that uses basic authentication pop-up so that I can test these websites without manual intervention. So in simple terms, what it's trying to say is I should be able to handle a pop-up or a basic auth pop-up like this and enter the username and password via code. I just want to automate this, right? So this is a very common use case and a very common requirement for almost any test. This would be like a precondition where you want to sign in and then check the rest of the flow for that website. So to do this, once we had the user story, we knew the feature, we had discussed a bit on it, and then we started thinking, what should we let the users do? So we came up with two options. We can either let users set the same credentials for all the websites, basically allow them to set certain credentials, and that'll be used for all the websites they're testing or pages, sub pages, irrespective of how the website is designed. Or we can give them the flexibility that, hey, set credentials for specific websites. So if you have a website path with a certain pattern or an exact website, set one particular credential, and for a different website, set a different credential. Again, this doesn't really matter much in terms of what website you're testing, but it matters in terms of giving the user flexibility, how they'd like to do or how they design the test suite to be. So if you're doing a precondition, if you're testing something for one website, you would just want to set the same credentials through it all. But say if you're trying to test some sub pages where you have initial login and then that takes you somewhere else where you have a different login, you want to set different credentials for these websites in the before hook for your tests. So it's just giving flexibility. You may use it however you like. You may also use it like Selenium and such tools also used for like web scraping. So you might want to set something up as well. So it totally really depends on your use case. People do funny things with Selenium. So now let's see how AI enters, right? So where does AI fit into this flow? Oh, sorry, let me just have a drink of water. Again, this diagram does seem similar to what we just went through. So you have your user stories and design. I kind of showed you how we navigate that. And once we design, before we write tests, right? So one major step we do is sit and write down test cases. So AI can help here as well. So when you're thinking of all your happy parts, edge cases, certain scenarios that you want to make sure are covered as a part of your design. Um, I like to just sit with a pen and paper and do like a brain dump and then transcend them into test cases and then write tests for it. But you could probably use AI for it as well. You could use generative AI, you could use test generators, like Brastack has one. I'll show you a snippet of it. There are different test generators available online. You can use any of the generative AI formats. So it's totally up to you how you would like to do it. But I would highly recommend that you first take a stab at the tests or the edge cases or everything you take care of, and then use AI just to see in case you missed out any test cases that you should be covering. And once you have your test cases and you have written tests, then when you want to write code for the test, you can then leverage AI. So instead of asking AI to write your test, I would recommend for test-driven development, the human should write the test, think it through, structure it well, make it exhaustive, and then kind of feed that as a structured context or as a prompt to your AI that, hey, I have these tests, please write the code for me. And you'll see why I say that, why it makes a lot of difference in terms of the quality of output that you get. And once you have the code, obviously make sure it compiles, works, run tests, and to make sure it does the right thing because AI is not perfect. But if you see, I have two human logos. So anywhere, it's very important to understand that human expertise is at the core. We are the ones guiding this. So AI is there to help us out, to make us productive, to assist us. But at the core, a lot of context and all comes from just the human expertise and the knowledge we hold as a part of the process. Now, this is a typical API design that we had. So we created, again, this is all examples as in Java, but we follow a similar pattern for JavaScript. We have a similar thing for any other language that we're doing. So in Java, we would just define a high-level interface, just a small blueprint of what the methods should look like. So if you see here, we say or have a method to add an authentication handler, pass a username, password to it. We say add authentication handler with something like a filter, basically any condition that should match a particular URL pattern, just pass it here, or even exact URL is fine. And what password and username we would want to set for it. Um, remove authentication handler in case you wanted to clean up, or clear authentication handlers again in the end hook or a cleanup when you want to remove all of this before your tests end. So we came up with this as a group. So I think so far we are so good. We had a user story, we went with the test design, I kind of showed you the flow we follow. So now we're at a part where we're done with, let me just go back. So we're done with the part where we're done with user stories, design. Now we want to create test cases. So like I said, you could do it manually, and that's how I've been doing for the longest time. Prostack has this cool test generator, but you could also use any other generative AI of your choice, um, as you wish. So Prostack has this test generator, and if you like to try it out, reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to extend a subscription for it. So it's generative AI here, and what I've done is I've just pasted my interface to it. That these are the APIs, and yeah, so I'm kind of giving it a prompt and telling it that I'm developing this interface using test-driven development. Give me the test cases. And this is what you pretty much would do with any generative AI. It's just that this AI agent is defined to generate test cases only. And I just ask you to generate test cases. So let's just give it some time, and then it starts kind of working its magic, thinking through like any Gen AI would do. And it starts also giving us the test cases, right? And it's done a grouping where it's talking about taking care of the authentication handler addition, then the other variation where we have a filtered authentication handler addition, take care of the removal, bulk removal, and it's given me a little bit more detail than I would have thought of. And under each of these categories, it's giving me more detailed test cases. For example, it's telling me how to look into checking for valid credentials and more details. Again, as you look through each of these, it's listed on all the test cases and even edge cases, right? Where like a null URL predicate or something that's always true or something that's complicated. So it's making me think through different combinations or edge cases to consider for. Yeah. So it just has everything in place, and you can add this to your test creation plan and things like that, but that's out of the scope of this talk. Removal, how you would do that. So these are very detailed test cases, and as a human, we would have covered most of them, but you could have missed out some, and this is helps in just kind of verifying that part for you. It's given me like 30 test cases, and for the demo, I'm like, okay, go ahead, let me just take a look at what you've told me. Yep. And then each of these have some detailed steps to it. They're all listed here. So if you click on either of them, you can just pick of anything that's of your choice. And it's a lot. So sometimes it's a lot more than what you would expect. And sometimes it's also considering accessibility, something that's a little beyond the scope of what you mean to test, because AI will do that. It'll make it nice and exhaustive for you, but it's totally up to you what you want to choose. So if you click on a test case details, it kind of tell you the steps you should do. This is an additional bonus. Maybe all AI agents may or may not do it, but if you prompt it further, it may. It'll also give you steps to actually how to then do it, right? With a detailed description and how you should actually write your test and what you need to validate at each step, right? So this was just like one example of how you can probably use AI to at least generate your test cases. But if it's okay if you don't want to, that's not the core of this idea, but it's okay to use it to validate. But I would suggest you think of the test cases first and then use AI to validate or get more ideas instead of other way around. So now we have that. So test cases are in place, and this is how our usage would look. Um, we would define a WebDriver and then go driver.network.add authentication handler, pass in the username, password. This is how the final usage should be looking. So this is the part where I sat down and wrote a few test cases. Again, for this demo, please try to understand this is actually a real feature. These test cases exist, but they're not, these are just high level test cases. They're not insanely detailed. They can be made detailed, but I started with these test cases for test driven development, where I made sure all my APIs are doing the correct thing. And again, if you look at generative AI, it did something similar, but way, way, way more thorough. Sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's not. It totally depends. So I went ahead and made sure I'm testing all my APIs. So I'm checking if I can add authentication handler. Can I add one with a filter? can add multiple authentication handlers with the filter, try adding, multiple authentication handlers with the same filter, remove an authentication handler, remove an handler that does not exist, and can clear handlers. So these are the test cases that I implemented first. I wrote tests for this. That's the first thing I did. Now, before doing this, I did a small exercise just to kind of see how it works when I try to use normal language prompt and ask GenAI to write my code and kind of see what assumptions it's made. So I opened ChatGPT. You can use anything of your choice. I pretty much gave it a copy of what is there in a GitHub issue. So I told that, hey, at Selenium Dem Summit, we agreed on this API, right? And we want it to be accessible from the network method available on the driver class. So you could do like driver.network.add handler. Um, and it can be language agnostic, and that's fine, like depending on what's a good practice in the language. And our API design has these APIs only. So I've given it a very short and a succinct prompt, but it also feels a little vague, but it's very difficult to give a lot of context in one go as well. Right? So that's what I have gone ahead and done. So Gen AI does its own thing. It starts responding. What I like is about generative AI, it tries to kind of reread or speak what you said in a more structural manner and kind of explain its understanding and including other concepts that you may or may not have thought of. Sometimes they're not even related, right? So, okay, it asks if I want a Java implementation. I'm like, yeah, go ahead for it, right? So it creates one. Again, tries to explain it. Oh, sometimes you may get some good practices out of it or things that you would have probably not thought of, which I think is pretty useful. It says make sure things are thread safe, which is a concern in Java. Make sure, it provides cleanup, which I don't think matters. It's a part of a thing. So this is what it has generated. It's created a list that takes care that passes in a by function. So if you notice, this is not at all the API we wanted, right? So we defined the APIs, but it's made a lot of assumptions. It made assumptions that we're able to add an authentication handler, but the method signature is something it's totally made assumptions about. And even the return type, it doesn't know what it wants to return, so it's returning the network class itself. It assumes that you should be able to chain all of this, which is vague, right? So it assumes that you should be able to do driver dot add authentication handler dot remove handler dot clear authentication handler. At the end of it, that would reach to a stage where you have no handlers at all. So ideally, chaining is not something that's intuitive for this particular functionality, but it still assumes one would do it, which is vague. So it's made assumptions, which is okay. Okay, we didn't give it method signature. It has doesn't have the context. It's made assumptions. And it's storing it in a list locally, maybe not the best way to kind of remove a handler, not so efficient if you have a lot of them. Um, yeah, it's just going through these things. And then now it declares a method called handle authentication, which has a URL and a realm. We never mentioned realm. It's not even related to this, but it's again made certain assumptions. And it has a method called handle authentication, which, if you notice, is marked internal method to process authentication, but it's marked as public. So anyone can use it. And even if the method is internal, none of the code is actually calling this method. If you look at the above three methods, add, remove, clear, none of them are looking at how to handle the authentication. So it's pretty vague, it's pretty inaccurate. Even if I didn't give it the correct method definition, it's implementing something that pretty much doesn't make sense to us at this point. Um, yeah, so that's what happened when I tried to do generative AI. Again, this is not true for all cases, but when I'm trying to implement something like authentication handler, which is slightly more complicated and has underlying nuances of using WebDriver BiDi protocol, because there was no context, it got pretty lost. Um, so then I'm like, Then I tried this one thing where I'm like, okay, how about I try to give it context as my tests that I've written. So because follow test-driven development, I make sure I've written tests first. And then I'm like, hey, can you generate the code for these tests, right? So because we have detailed tests and test is code, code is structured, and it's easier for any machine to read something that is structured. So it's the same test that I discussed with all of you earlier. But if you can see here, it's very clear the usage of our method, what it should return, what edge cases does it handle, or what it should be able to do. So we've given it a way more richer context because we have thorough tests that were there. And yeah, then it starts generating things, gives us certain tips and advice, just like any Gen AI. And now let's see what it's actually given us. And this is an implementation that's very close to what would be there if I wrote it as well. So it gives us a network class, which is okay. And now it starts storing things in hash map. Again, way more performant than the list. It has the correct method definition because now it knows how we use it in our tests and what should, correct method be. It does correct thing of method overloading in Java, so it does the right thing. Also kind of telescoping things there. It maintains an internal counter for the authentication handler. So every time you add a handler, you have ID to refer it so you can remove it later. So it started doing a lot of things that make a lot of sense now. Yep. So this is code that you can actually start using it. It's a good structure boilerplate for one to get started. And it's also defined a data type to use internally to store this handler. That's great. And then I kind of try to tell it, hey, you've done a decent job, but you're not using anything from WebDriver BiDi spec, right? So we want the underlying way, or the correct way to implement this is to use the WebDriver BiDi spec. Can you use these two commands? So can you go ahead and use something called on authentication required, on auth required command, and and can you use a command called continue request? So irrespective of this is correct or wrong, it tries to then go integrate that. So it's like, okay, I will integrate that. And that's exactly what it does for us. Yep. It kind of tells you that it uses on auth required to listen to events. And then uses continue requests to pass on their credentials ahead. We're like, okay, that's fine. It kind of puts certain methods to use this, which is great. It makes a few assumptions about where or how to call on auth required, but I don't blame it. It doesn't have the context, so it will make assumptions. I know now there are a lot of generative AIs or like AI agents where you can upload like a big code base. With open source, that's okay. Maybe with closed source, you can't always share everything that you have there. So it really depends on what tools you have access to. And then the way it does this is um, every time it listens to an authentication event, it writes code to then handle the request. So it looks for the appropriate handler. If there's a handler, finds the correct credentials and then passes it along. So it gives me a nice logic. Very different from the first iteration where it just hallucinated and didn't give us the right thing. So now it's doing a lot more logical things. Again, very close to what we would have done as humans while writing code. You don't have to worry too much about the code, but just have to understand the crux of what I'm trying to tell you here. So now we are in good shape, right? So next, what I try to do is let's implement. Please bear in mind that whatever I'm trying to show next is actually what happened in reality, but it's also a very squeezed down version of it. When you're developing a feature, it's not something that can be done in a few minutes. It does take a few days, weeks to get to it. Also, a lot of contextual knowledge, right? So in the code base, we kind of go driver.network. So this is the method where the network method and how it looks. Um, what we need is we want to implement something called remote network that implements the interface we discussed earlier. So we want to implement these methods there. So what I do is I pretty much copy paste the code we got from ChatGPT at that point, right? Yeah, so I just take what was shared and I put it here. Obviously, it's not perfect. It doesn't have the right imports. You need to kind of fix it. So you need to make sure at least it's in a state that will compile correctly. So just kind of sorting that out. It makes a certain assumptions about the WebDriver BiDi commands as well because it doesn't know how they're to be called. It doesn't have the context. We fix it. But these fixes are very minor if you are used to the project setup compared to a very vague code. So it's given us a lot of logic or boilerplate to work with that you can fine tune for the crux logic. So this is just how any developer would kind of fix your errors. I try to just look around and dig in, find the correct methods to use. And then I realize, okay, I don't think continue request makes sense. There are actual methods that are continue with auth, without auth, that are more useful. So I made an error, right? So if I give it a wrong context, it used the wrong context. So I go ahead and try to tell it that, hey, I just realized that gave you the wrong WebDriver BiDi methods. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to you. So I tell it, I made a mistake. Please don't use continue request. Use continue with auth because that's the correct method to use. And it will update it as it is. It will do what is told. It will not question you. It will not correct you. It will not go ahead and figure out what the correct methods or underlying protocol should be. It just updates it. And you're like, okay, it's fine. Let's see how that works. So we go ahead, update our code with it. Again, fix a certain compile issues, which is okay. Make sure we're passing the right parameters and everything based on the methods we have. I'll just go quickly over this part too. Just make some fixes. Um, yeah. And we realize if the handler is present, you can use continue with auth. But if there is no handler, you probably need a different method. So you kind of find the continue request and go with it. And now we try to run a test. This is the test that we have, and we're like, okay, no compile errors. Let's try to make sure the test passes, just like you would do for any TDD. And it fails. And then we realize, oh, it's failing because it's trying to use a data type it created, and it uses something called Java record. Now that came on to actually very later versions of Java compared to the one Selenium uses. So we kind of again triage that using this. We say, hey, I'm getting an error. And it's like, okay, it looks like your Java version does not support the record. So it tells us it came in your version. So if you're using something older, it does not exist, which is okay. But think about it. If you're coding and you're trying to do this, how much context can you provide? So if you don't provide the correct version, again, there are chances of you getting slowed down or there could be bugs. So it gives us an updated code, which we then decide to pretty much copy paste, use it, and try to run the test again. Just update the code based on the like, okay. Now again, no errors. Let's try to run this again. Or just bear with me. I understand this feels long. It's just that I'm trying to prove a point of what happens. So try to run a test and let's see if this time it does the right thing. Yeah. And in the process, I remember that while we asked it to listen to the events, there was one more requirement from the spec where you needed to intercept authentication requests first. It never told me I was missing that. It never told me that it could be buggy. It never added it to the code. But so this is the kind of context that would exist because of something I read, of reading a ByteDance spec correctly, or probably even Googling and identifying the correct thing. So this is like a context that should have been given to human, sorry, given to the AI, but it's known to the human. So I do a quick fix here again because it's a short recording. I'm trying to squeeze everything in. Things are still failing. I realized, okay, if there is no handler, I'm still giving it a wrong method. So I kind of go ahead and finally fix it that, you know, if you don't have the credentials, don't use them and the correct method for it. But again, AI never helped you kind of fix it. This is all in your head or something that humans would know because of the knowledge they possess. So I think finally this should work. And this did. And if you realize it wouldn't have taken me just 7 minutes to figure this out, took me a while to kind of figure all of this and stitch it together. So, yep, one test pass. Hopefully, all our tests pass and we are good to go. Yep. So we finally have the feature in a good shape. Of course, it can be refactored and improved, but this pretty much exists in Selenium today. Pick the latest version, you can go run it and see this is actually from the code base. It's there, I've written it, I followed the practice. It was a bumpy ride. Do you see it's there? So, what were my learnings from this entire exercise? It's context is everything. So use AI, use it with precaution because you need to give it the right context. It can be a garbage in, garbage out situation. For example, when I gave it the wrong methods to use, it just used it blindly. When I gave it the correct methods, it just updated it blindly to some extent because probably it didn't have the context. Maybe if I gave it a link of the WebDriver spec or the underlying protocol, it could have done a good job, but I'm not very confident of that. But it really depends on the AI tool you're using. So correct context is everything. AI accuracy. So like I said, the accuracy of AI would typically depend on the context you've given and what it understands out of it. So if you give it wrong methods, it will use wrong methods. If you give it a generic prompt, it will make a lot of assumptions like it did the first time and it created something that was barely usable, right? Also, if we did not give it context about the language version we're using, it made assumptions and gave us that, which can also lead to a lot of back and forth for really big complex projects. So you need to take the AI accuracy with a pinch of salt and make sure you're reading everything and understanding what it's kind of delivering it back to us. In my belief, test-driven development facilitates a lot of context, simply because the tests are written by us, by humans, our expertise is very much baked in. It gives us the correct inputs, method definitions, return types, structure. So, like I said, you're giving AI structured context in the form of code that it can read and interpret very nicely and then generate code for it. So giving your tests as a context is a very good base for it to get started. It gave me something that was very useful compared to me giving it a verbal prompt, which wasn't so useful. Again, it might also be a case that everyone comes from different regions of the world, and AI is biased in terms of how we can communicate. It may not understand what you're trying to tell it accurately. So having something that is structured like code, which is relatively universal in everyone's understanding, AI will have a little better results because it's a more structured context. And human expertise is the core. So you saw examples where at the end I had to kind of use my brains, rack my brain to then figure out why everything is still failing, though it's compiling correctly. What are the nuanced steps that are there? And that just solely came from the readings, the knowledge I had, and same way for anything, it matters that you have the human expertise as the core. We don't want AI kind of, it's not going to replace us. It's there to help us, assist us, make things faster for us. But then we need to figure out that quality is not sacrificed as a part of it. And yeah, thank you so much for sticking around and listening to me uh, talk through it all. I'll just stop sharing my screen and if anyone has any questions. Yeah, I'm more than happy to have any questions. You want to put them in chat or however, I'm happy to answer that.
I will drop one. You didn't
Mm.
mention the time. How much time did you need for everything from the requirements until the test passing?
So I wish I had taken a nice note of this, but I think from because it's open source, requirements came in at some point, and then I picked it up when my bandwidth permitted. But I think to develop this, it would have taken me at least 4 or 5 days, or not full days, like chunks of days, but around 4 days ish. But that is also because I knew the WebDriver BiDi spec. I knew where to go look for answers, right? Which, like I said, it's very difficult for me to cover in 7 minutes and show you the entire flow, how I would have done it. And I think any development process is not easy. You play with AI, you get stuck. You kind of then think, oh, this is how I want to design it. And then you kind of start writing code. But luckily, AI is at least helping kickstart the skeleton. But we also take time to then write test cases, make sure they are correct. It's an iterative process and a journey. It's not as smooth as one sees in a webinar, but when you sit to do it, but AI really helped at least get the boilerplate down. So that was a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat.
Yeah. Um, okay. I think someone has a question on BDD. Um, I apologize, I don't fully understand. Probably if you misunderstood, so I've spoken solely about TDD today. Uh, so even I'm a little lost on this. Yeah, I think it feels a little out of context for today, but okay. But when you showed the AI generated test cases displayed, but something that looked more like documentation, was that the comments extracted from test cases, or is the test code generated in 2 steps? So what I tried to show you was a test case generator that's developed by Browstack, but you could use any generative AI. Um, yeah, so that was in code. I understand that looked like documentation, but it was just trying to use a different AI agent to get all the test cases that I need. And in each of these test cases, there were additional steps as to how you can implement them. So that's what I was trying to show. So I think the way I like to do it is, I know you're asking if was it extracted from the test cases, the test case generated in 2 steps. So test code is something I wrote. The test cases is something I think it's a good idea to first do a brain dump manually and then use AI to kind of double check something or see if you miss something. Okay, if you'd like to know the browser stack uh, tools, it's called the test case management tool. You can reach out to me more, I can help you out. But there are many such tools out there. But yeah, it was the test case management tool by Browstack. Any more questions?
So then, Pooja, thank you very much for your talk. I will share my slide.
Wait, there is a last question.
Okay.
Did
Did
you
I get
get
any pushback?
Yeah, sure, I can wait.
Yeah, I think, sorry, it says, did I get any kind of pushback from colleagues? Actually, no. So if you look at from both standpoints, first of all, because this was an open source project, it's all out in the open, so you can see what I do, and at least the Selenium contributors that I work with are amazing folks. Different things, but they also know that, like I said, human expertise is the core. So as long as I'm pushing out code that makes sense, all the tests are passing. That's as per the design, and it's done with good quality because nothing is merged in the branch without getting reviewed. They're okay with it. So I don't think they had any complaints if I'm contributing. do it with well aware of what's being pushed. So yeah, they are pretty supportive of it.
So any other questions? Okay, so then thank you very much again, Pooja. So let's go. What's coming next? We already planned our next meetup at the end of October, 29th of October. We have Leander Melendez also with his topic about AI-powered performance testing. So I hope to see you there. And the last information for today, as I told you, we have a small present for you at the end of October and the middle of October, in the middle of October in London and in the end of October in Nashville, Tricentris organized Tricentris Transform 2025. And you as members of Continuous Testing Meetup, you can get or you will get 50% off of any tickets. So make a screenshot from this screen, just write down the promo code or scan the QR code and just assign for the conference or for the events. So hope to see you there. So thank you very much again and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.